My name is Jason Stewart. I am a reference librarian here at Regent University Library. I'd like to welcome you all to the speaker series for the Living Word Biblical Antiquities exhibit, and especially Miss Carroll's class from Stonebridge. Glad to have you guys here today. This morning's talk will be by Dr. Lyle Story. He is professor of Biblical Languages and New Testament here at Regent. He received his Master's of Divinity and PhD both from Fuller Theological Seminary. He is a scholar who has published in many journals. He was a contributor to the Encyclopedia of Pentecostal and Charismatic Christianity in 2005. He also produced a multimedia tutorial on learning Koine Greek called Greek to Me. So if you're interested in learning about biblical Greek, then it's probably very useful. He has a passion for teaching students and the transformation that occurs in the classroom. So I think we'll all enjoy his speech today. There should be a Q&A session at the end of his talk, so if you have any questions, jot them down or keep them in your head for that time. Please welcome Dr. Lyle Story.
Thank you, Jason. Well, good to have all of you. I've been charged today with filling you in a little bit on some background information about how we end up with our Greek text as it is today, bearing in mind that there is a tremendous, almost astronomical difference between the way we copy things and the copying process over the years. If you're in your office or at home, what are some of the ways that you use to copy things? Pardon? All right. What else? Copy machine. Writing. Carbon paper. When I was in grade school and high school, we had the old mimeograph machines that had purple markings, and you always almost got a high when you were over at the mimeograph machine because of all the alcohol. We have Xerox machines that will give a good copy. Those Xerox machines can enlarge. They can make smaller, then they can do color, they can staple, they can bind, they can collate. And so in our day today, which is driven by electronics, we are a far cry removed from the process of transmission of the Greek text over the years. All right. Here's a job description for a scribe. 40-hour work week. Must possess superior writing skills. Superior concentration for the whole of the workday. Willing to take correction. The conditions. In terms of your workspace, you don't have a nice table with a comfortable chair. You're sitting on a stool or a bench, and you have a board that is resting on your knees. And so when you are writing, you are in a constant hunched over position. In the environment, very, very cold in the winter. Very hot and humid in the summer. And to that, I would also add very poor ventilation and very poor lighting to be able to see what you're doing. Your pay is your room and board. No conversation during working hours. You've got to have excellent eyesight. And hearing is a must. And I put hearing here because sometimes the process of transmission of the text, there would be one reader up front who would be reading the biblical text, and everybody else would have to copy what they heard. Also, discipline for errors. Often missing meals for a full day. And sometimes whipping for being careless with what you've done. Now, how many want to sign up for that kind of job? No benefits, no vacations, no health plan, no pension plan. And for pay, you simply have housing and food. And a commitment for 15 years of doing the same thing over and over again. Now, the papyrus reed, from which we get various papyrus documents, was a reed that grew along the River Nile, and they worked well in a sort of a marshy area. If you were to go down to a landscape place, they sell little papyrus plants that you can plant and then watch grow. And obviously during the wintertime they die. Now, what I'm going to be giving you is just some numbers here in terms of the various types of manuscripts that have fed their way into the Greek New Testament. There's some 5,500 plus manuscripts that have been discovered. And 76 of them are from the papyri. Now, the plants that I just showed you, they are cut in cross sections, and they're laid out so that you have a horizontal row, and on top of the horizontal row like this, then you would have another row going perpendicular to that, and in between you would have some type of soot, gum, glue that would hold these pieces together. When I say 76 papyri, I don't mean a full New Testament. Maybe half a chapter, maybe a full chapter, maybe one book out of the New Testament. And they are pressed together into one fabric. The normal length of these is approximately 35 feet, and this would be in the rolled form and be put into scroll format. Now, you may be interested to know that the book of Luke would take up between 30 and 35 feet, which may well explain why Luke, when he wants to talk about the movement, progress, development of the Christian life in the book of Acts, starts a new document. He starts a new papyrus because he's run out of space. So that's why he starts off in the book of Acts where he says, the first account I composed, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began to do and to teach. And then what he does is he extends now into the second papyrus, the book of Acts, that can be really regarded as the continuous account of what Jesus began to do and teach. Did you see how Luke is what he began to do, and then in the book of Acts, it's what he continues to do in and through the apostles, and particularly the role of the Holy Spirit that we find so prominent, not only in Acts 1 and 2, but on through the rest of the book. Now, some also appeared in codex form. And this would be similar to what we have with notebooks, where you have a left hand that is glued together or fastened together in some way. So you would have various leaves, papyrus, that would be bound on the left. So those are that's the codex. The plural is codices, C-O-D-I-C-E-S. Now, these were the papyrus that have been discovered. These things were written between the 1st and the 3rd century. So some 76 of these. The codices were written in all capital form. I mean the capital letters of the Greek alphabet, not the small letters. And they're called uncials. In Latin, the word uncia means inch. So these works were written 1 inch high with all capital letters, no word spacing, no punctuation, no verse numbers or chapter divisions. Those came much later. Now you may say, how in the world did they read? I would say if you had been taught to read that way, your mind would naturally break up words from each other. It's a little strange for us because when we learn to read, we learn to recognize that there's a little space in between words, and each word is its own unit. All right, I just put a picture here. This is in current times in Rwanda. You'll see the weaving together of papyri there. And you see the little reeds there that are slid in between as they're woven together. That would be similar to what the original papyri would look like. All right, here's an example of the Chester Beatty Papyrus. And while I'm on that, let me, if I could get a couple just to help me distribute these. I thought it might be helpful just to have a summary sheet of some significant ancient manuscripts as we go along. Are we about there? Does everybody have one? Brian, there's a hand up over here. All right, Chester Beatty Papyri. Look in the left-hand column about 3/4 of the way down. This collection of 11 codices, that's the plural of codex, they were discovered in 1930, and they date from the 2nd to the 3rd centuries, which is a tremendous manuscript. The 3 New Testament codices contain the earliest known copies of Paul's work. So they were found in 1930, but they're dated between the 2nd and 3rd century. Up at the top column there, do you see Codex Sinaiticus? It picks up its name because this manuscript was found in St. Catherine's Monastery on Sinai. There was a count by the name of Count Tischendorf, who was an archaeologist, and he was working his way through various sites in the Mediterranean world. They came to the monastery, and he noticed a boy that was trying to build up a fire. And lo and behold, the shepherd boy was burning up pages from Codex Sinaiticus. It really is a remarkable story. By the way, if you'd be interested in reading that, there's a book by Bruce Metzger called The Text of the New Testament, and there's a whole chapter devoted, and it's kind of like an adventure novel, at least that chapter is, as he describes what happened when this count discovered the manuscript. It contains all of the New Testament. It has 147 and a half leaves, most of the Old Testament and parts of the Epistle of Barnabas and Shepherd of Hermas, for a total of 350 or 46 leaves. And the entire manuscript is in Greek, and it is housed in the British Museum in London. Going down to the bottom of the page, you see Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. This 5th century Greek Bible is a palimpsest. There's a new word I don't think you've heard before. Let me just give you an illustration. Let's suppose that someone who would be a non-Christian, and they would come into his possession a papyrus or a leather manuscript, and he doesn't care about what's written, so what he does is he scrapes all the writing off, and then maybe he's sent down to Food Lion to get some food, and his wife gives him a grocery list, and she writes the grocery list on this document that has been scraped off. Now, people who work in the area of archaeology and text criticism, through the use of chemicals, they're able to see what is under the grocery list. That is a portion of the text of the New Testament that's done with chemicals. And a couple other notes here. Look in the left-hand column, the John Ryland's fragment. This tiny fragment is the oldest known New Testament document, dating from the first half of the 2nd century, and it contains 3 verses out of the book of John. I'll show you a copy of that. I'll put on the screen. And then down at the bottom, another very important manuscript is Codex Vaticanus. This fine vellum document, that is a document that's written on leather, from the 4th century, contains the whole Bible except Genesis 1 through 46. It's the oldest and best extant Septuagint manuscript. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew. It was known to be in the Vatican Library as early as 1481, but was not published until 1889 to 90. Written in uncials, the book contains 759 leaves. All right, this is that document I mentioned there on the John Ryland's Papyrus, the oldest New Testament fragment. It goes by the number P52. P stands for papyrus, and it's given the number of 52. So that's what it is. 3 verses out of John 18. All right, then from the 3rd to the 13th century, we have what are called parchments. These are documents that are written on leather. And so you would have various skin hides that would be attached together, and they appeared some in scroll form and others occurred in the codex form where you have the binding on the left. We possess 242 parchments. Now, vellum that we saw on the other sheet, it means a particular fine type of hide. For instance, the antelope, particularly good skin for writing on, and not quite so thick as some of the others might be. In both scroll and codices form, codices again is where you have the binding on the left. Writing is possible on both sides of the skin. So you would have the back and the front. They removed the hair by scraping. They washed them and smoothed them with pumice. And then they would dress them up with chalk. Now, some of the vellum were dyed a deep purple and written with gold and silver links. Now, some of the later scribes, they got upset with this, particularly fancy looking manuscripts. They thought that the church was becoming too worldly, so they would write correctives that the Greek New Testament is not to be adorned with worldly things. So some of them have extensive artwork, like off on one side of the margin, and this special treatment that we're given. It caused a problem for some of the scribes. All right, again, all capitals, no punctuation, no word spaces, no numbers or chapters. This is an example of the Codex Sinaiticus from the 3rd and 4th century. Now, I have a couple over there after our session today that you can take a look at. And there's also a couple over there that show the papyrus. I just have some loose leaves here. And if you can kind of take a look and pass them around. These are what are called a facsimile of the original. This comes from the 3rd and 4th century, and I already mentioned to you just where this manuscript is found and housed. All right, Codex Vaticanus in the 4th century. This is what it looks like. Now, let me see here. You see the cursor right there? All right, that's in Greek, it's epsilon nu, which in Greek means in. And then you have the tau, omicron, iota, and that's the final sigma there. Tois, which means in the. And then, let me go back. Right here, we have the word oikos, which means the houses. This comes from Matthew 11. All right, and then from the 9th century following, we have a group of manuscripts that are written in minuscule style. Now, look at the bottom there. That's an example of what a minuscule would look like. And this is the type that I work with when I work with the Greek New Testament. I work with the minuscules. Now, the pronunciation of that bottom line is en arche ein halagas kai halagas. So you'll see the Greek letters there with word spaces in between. Now, above there would be an example of the same Greek text in uncial style. Uncia means what? An inch high. And so you'll see just a block of capital letters one after the other. Now, we have also a group of 2,135 lectionaries, that is from both using the Old Testament as part of the worship liturgy. How many of you come from more of a high church background where you have readings for the day? Some of you? Okay, 1, 2. This would be like an Episcopalian, some Lutheran, certainly in the Catholic tradition. This is where you have readings for the worship service that are based upon the religious calendar. For instance, before Christmas, you would have a series of readings for 4 weeks during the period called Advent. There'd be passages taken from the Psalms, prophets, Gospels, and maybe something from the Apostle Paul that would be knit together in one reading that the congregation would read in liturgical style based upon the religious calendar. In the spring, you would have the Epiphany, where you have the pagan astrologers who come to Bethlehem to worship. And you have a series of readings attached to that. And then during Passion Week, and particularly Good Friday and Easter, you would have selections from the Old and New Testament that directly relate to what was taking place in the life of Christ. So we have some dated lectionary readings from Augustine of Hippo, and the list of readings is compiled from him. We can find that a general pattern is that of one or more Old Testament readings, one or more non-gospel New Testament readings, one or more psalm, and one or more gospel readings that would be pulled together on a particular day of worship. The psalm citations that are used use the Greek psalms numbering. And so you see down there the Nativity of the Lord in December 25. You've got Isaiah 53, Romans 5, Psalm 84, and then Luke 2, which contains the Luke's birth narrative, including Joseph and Mary going down to Bethlehem, why they had to go there, and the birth of the Christ child, and the shepherds, visitation of the angels to the shepherds, and other things that are part of the entire narrative. And that would gravitate around the December 25. So then you can see some other things, Stephen there and his death, James and the beheading of John the Baptist. Down there you'll see Epiphany. And you have the beginning of Lent. What does Lent mean? Or what does Lent mean to you? Anybody?
Giving up something.
Yeah, giving up with something for a period of time. It would reflect the time period of Jesus and his temptation and prepare the congregation for the Passover season. Now, the combination of the papyri and the parchments and the minuscules and the lectionaries all feed their way into a number of 5,500 plus documents that text critics draw upon for the Greek New Testament. This does not include the number of versions like in Syriac, Latin, or Coptic, or the many, many quotations from the early church fathers, like in the 2nd century, where they would be quoting something from the extant New Testament. So above 5,500, we just have numerous translations into various languages as the gospel spread. And then the church fathers. All right, some scribal prayers. Writing bows one's back, thrusts the ribs into one's stomach, and fosters a general debility of the body. Can you understand that? I mean, none of these people were fitness gurus. Here's a prayer by one of the scribes as he finished his document. As travelers rejoice to see their home country, so also is the end of a book to those who toil in writing. So he saw that at least this journey was completed. One comment relates the complaint that a heavy snowstorm was raging outside and that the scribe's ink froze, his hand became numb, and the pen fell from his fingers. I mean, we're not talking about central heating or air conditioning here. The end of the book. Thanks be to God. Whoever says, God bless the soul of the scribe, God will bless his soul. Mercy be to him who wrote, O Lord, wisdom to those who read, grace to those who hear, and salvation to those who own this codex. Another comment here. There's no scribe who will not pass away, but what his hands have written will remain forever. All right. You can well imagine that in the process of copying, we have the possibility of errors. Have you at some time had occasion where you were given a sheet of paper and then you had to handwrite what was on the sheet of paper? Anybody? There's always the possibility of error, right? All right, now with the uncials, we look up there at those block of capital letters. What do you think it says? God is nowhere. Or what? God is now here. It just depends where you make the word space. All right. A scribe with faulty eyesight or astigmatism. Perhaps the scribe hasn't been to his optometrist for a while. And so some of the letters are confused. All right, look at the first two. The first two is the capital sigma, gives a S sound. And the next letter is the capital epsilon, which gives the sound of a eh. Well, you can imagine if you're looking at a document and your eyesight is a little bit blurry, you would have trouble with those two, right? Or the next two letters, we have a capital theta, which gives the sound of a th. And the one right next to it is the capital omicron. Well, it would be an easy thing to confuse those two letters, right? If you had a little bit blurriness. All right. There are also errors that are introduced with faulty hearing. Sometimes consonants and vowels may not be properly heard. All right, I'd like for you to turn to 1 Thessalonians 2:7 with your Bible. If those of you who have it, I'd be interested in what your translation says. Would somebody read 2:7? 1 Thessalonians 2:7.
But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children.
All right, we were gentle among you. Anybody else have a different translation than gentle? Pardon? Go ahead.
But we proved to be gentle among you as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children.
All right, so you also had the word gentle. Anybody else with something else different? Go ahead.
We were like children among you.
Yeah, the word there is infants or babes. Now, let me tell you how the problem arose. The word for we became or proved to be is agenethemen. Can you say that? Agenethemen. We became. Now, the word that follows is either napioi, which means infants or babes, or the word apioi, that means gentle. Now, the last letter of agenethemen has the sound of a n, doesn't it? An N. Now, if I'm saying it out loud and I say agenethemen apioi, can you tell the difference? Napioi, apioi. You can't hear it, right? Agenethemen napioi or agenethemen apioi. It would be very hard to distinguish between the two, just because of that last letter of the verb, which has the sound of an N, na. Agenethemen apioi. And so text critics work with the various documents, and some of them may have the reading of apioi, gentle, and others read napioi, infants or babes. But that would be an issue of hearing, particularly if the scribe that was reading the document and everybody was copying, they weren't sure what they heard. Unless the lector, that is the scribe reading, made a stop between the two words. And it was agenethemen, stop, and then napioi or apioi. But if it was just read as straight, it would be very, very hard to distinguish that, right? All right, there are also errors of the mind. Now, copying includes several layers from what you see or hear to what you write. All right, take a look at the next two words in the transliteration. Elaban, I received, or egbalan, I threw. Now, if you just look at the shape of the word, the shape of the two words is very similar, isn't it? And sometimes when we're reading, something goes on in our head that says, this word has this particular shape. And sometimes we misspell things because something may be misspelled and we're looking at it, we read it the right way, and it has the same letters and basically the same shape, but there may be two vowels that might be crossed up. For instance, take the word people, P-E-O-P-L-E. one of the readings may be Poeple. But if you look at it and you're reading hurriedly, your mind would turn that misspelled word into its proper spelling just because of looking at the word shape. Now, copying involves several distinct processes. If you're looking at one document and then copying it on the second document, you have to look carefully at the spelling. You've got to register that in your mind. And then you take what is registered in your mind, and then your body makes a physical movement of making marks on the second document. There are 4 distinct processes involved in copying from one thing over to another, and errors can be made in that process. Let's suppose you're a scribe in a monastery and you're copying along, and there's a chirping bird outside the window, and you are on the word "and" when that bird chirped. When your eye goes back to the text from which you're copying, you may land on the wrong word "and." Haven't you ever done that? You're copying something and, you're going back and you may miss a whole line because you landed on the wrong "and" when you looked back at the original document. So there's some funny errors that were created. For instance, in John 17, Jesus said, "I pray that you would not take them out of the world, but keep them from the evil one." And a couple of manuscripts read, "I pray that you would not keep them from the evil one." That first line got glossed over. Perhaps the scribe corrects an error that was in his original text, spelling or grammar. And these would be intentional changes. Sometimes scribes would try and harmonize some discordant parallels, that is, things that are difficult, by something that they would know by heart. Sometimes clarifying materials added. All right, "I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now, maybe a scribe was overzealous and he wanted his audience to know that sinners also are called to repentance. So he added on the last line, "unto repentance," just to make it clear. Clearing up some historical or geographical difficulties. If you read all 4 Gospels, there's a discrepancy in time between how long Jesus was on the cross, either 3 or 6 hours. Sometimes scribes were motivated by doctrinal issues. For instance, in Luke 23:32. Look at the reading there. "And also other criminals too were led away with him to be crucified." Now that little word "also," what might that imply? Wouldn't it imply that Jesus was a criminal when you use the word "other"? Also other? A scribe may have seen that and wanted to make it clear that Jesus was not a criminal as these other 2 insurrectionists were. So maybe there's a change there to make it clear. Now, in 1 Thessalonians 3:2, about Timothy, there's some statements that are made about him. We have 5 different readings. God's fellow worker, God's servant, servant and God's fellow worker, God's servant and our fellow worker. So 5 different manuscript traditions that describe Timothy. Now, when text critics work with the biblical text and the various manuscripts that are there, one of the principles they operate on is that the shorter reading is to be preferred, and also the more difficult reading is to be preferred in terms of what was more original. You all have at some point in time turned in a research paper, and in the process of doing the research paper, and you go back over it, you make revisions to it, don't you? You may add in some explanatory clauses of something that wasn't clear, or filled out a sentence and improved the language. But the issue is, what was more original? That's what New Testament text critics work their way to. What is the more original? That's what they're after. And then they also work with the principle that when a person, a text critic, works on a manuscript, they also need to provide some explanation as to why the other readings arose. How did it happen that we now have other readings? Now, in terms of difficulty or theological issue, does anybody see a problem with God's fellow worker? What might be the problem there?
Like God.
Yeah, like God. Go ahead, Asia. Or, I'm sorry, Trey. Okay, you note the apostrophe there. Somebody else, what might be a problem with that? Somebody? Yeah, equality with God. I mean, isn't that a pretty lofty title to give to a human being that would seem to put that Timothy on par with God? He's God's fellow worker. Now, look at how some of the other readings, if a scribe saw that and he said, man, that's too highfalutin a title for Timothy. All right, so number 1 is God's fellow worker, and then we just have fellow worker. That removes the problem by removing God's, right? He's just a fellow worker. He's not described as God's fellow worker. Other manuscript contain, there's a switch from fellow worker to servant. Well, that's much more palatable. It doesn't put the servant on par with God the way God's fellow worker is. Another manuscript, servant and God's fellow worker. Now we still have God's fellow worker, but Timothy is also noted as servant. And then the last reading, God's servant and our fellow worker. All right, so now we have the clear lines drawn between God and Timothy. From the standpoint of God, he's God's servant, and from the standpoint of human beings, he is our fellow worker. So when text critics make decisions about what they believe to be the more original and that's their job. They also have to explain how some of the other readings came into being. Now, let me just say this. When I say text critic or textual criticism, I'm not talking about a group of people that are sitting around criticizing the Bible. Text criticism is a science all by itself. That is different from simply translating and interpreting the Greek Testament. My father, who taught at Princeton Seminary for a number of years, when I was a kid, we went up to a lake in New Hampshire, and my father was with a group of 12 people, and they were from the United Bible Society. And they were working through one particular manuscript in terms of its tradition. They did that for 2 weeks and worked all day on it. I had no clue what they were doing at the time. I was out fishing. But text criticism is a discipline and science all in and of itself. Now, I just bring this up because this is my earlier discussion about some of the bad working conditions for the scribes. That we, in our 21st century, we need to appreciate the thousands of people that are involved in the transmission of the text. Poor housing, poor ventilation, subject to cold and heat, physical posture, the challenge of intensive concentration, looking at a text or listening to a lector. Now, I assume most of you belong to a local church, and you know that just even in the local church, you're called on to appreciate the body of Christ where you worship. That is, other people that are part of the church, to appreciate them, their worth, their value, their gifts, the contribution that they make to the whole thrust of a particular church. And what I want to suggest to you today, that it is also important for us to realize that the body of Christ goes backwards in time as well. So we in the 21st century need to feel a sense of indebtedness for the thousands of people over thousands of years that have felt that the Bible was important enough to devote their lives to its transmission for a new and fresh generation. Do you hear what I'm getting at? We belong to them. And that's part of who we are, and it's part of what we need to feel and appreciate. We belong with the heritage of others who have faced such challenges. And I just want to take you back to the job description of the scribe. We belong to those people that have devoted a 15, 20-year block of their life to do nothing but copy, and the concentration required for copying. And here are men and women that express a driving commitment to express the Word of God to each new and fresh generation. Now, I'm just giving you a brief summary in terms of how text critics go about their job of seeking to find what was more original. They evaluate a manuscript based upon the date that archaeologists ascribe to a particular papyrus or parchment. Scholars also look to the geographical distribution. They also look at genealogical relationship, and the manuscripts then are weighed rather than counted. And so it's not just a matter of saying, here are 3 documents that support such and such a reading, and here are 500 on the other hand that support a different reading. If those 500, by way of genealogy, are based upon a faulty manuscript, guess what? They're going to make the same error from the original. I mean, it goes back to the principle that a chain really is as strong as what? Its weakest link. So if you have a link that's weak and everything's built off of that, then you've got, you know, multiple errors that occur over the course of time. All right. So scholars look both at the external evidence and they also look at internal evidence. One principle is that the more difficult reading is to be preserved. Generally, when people see a difficulty, or you're working on a term paper and you see a difficulty, what do you try to do? You hide it, or you may change the word, you may cross out a word and put something correct in. But what is more original in terms of what you wrote is that first document. I mean, I write journal articles, and a manuscript that I might submit to a journal may go through 10 different revisions at least. Because every time I go back, I'm trying to improve and make corrections and to clarify something that may be vague. The text critic says, what is the more difficult one? Because generally in transmission and in copying, people make improvements. Another principle is that the shorter reading is generally to be preferred. Later copyists may add in something that in effect make it longer, the actual text. And third, verbal dissonance is to be preferred. That is, dissonance means a clash, where there's something clashing. Text critics usually go with that, a document where there's some kind of clash, as being the more originals. Other scribes coming along would seek to rectify or correct something that was there that was something of a clash. All right. In John 5, we have the healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. Remember, there at that pool with 5 porticos, we have lots of people that were laying there. Look at the King James. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, of halt, withered. And then in yellow, I put the words that is found in the King James Version, waiting for the movement of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatsoever disease that he had. And then verse 5, and a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. That's King James. In the RSV, here's what you have. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. In verse 5, one man was there who had been ill for 38 years. The RSV is missing the end of verse 3, 3b, and the whole of verse 4. It doesn't have it there. It may have it in some of your marginal notes. Now, take a look at the external evidence that include verses 3b and 4. And you'll see off to the left there the letters A, C, K, L, and then capital delta. A stands for the document called Alexandrinus. All right, this was written in the 5th century, C from the 5th century, K from the 9th century, L 8th century, and then the delta 9th century. Now, take a look at 5 manuscripts that exclude verses 3b and 4. Papyrus 66, about 200 AD. P75, early 3rd century. The next one is the Hebrew letter Aleph that is attached to a certain manuscript. 4th century, B, and then D also in the 5th century. Now, just looking externally at the date, the dates there, what might you conclude? Anybody?
Well, the one that leaves it out is the oldest.
Yeah, the ones that leave it out are the oldest. They begin in the 2nd century. And at least this block goes up to the 5th century, while the other that includes it, upon which the King James is based, they start in at the 5th century. So that's one factor that they'll be looking at in terms of just the date, the genealogy, and the quality of a particular manuscript. That's external. That would seem to favor its omission. The original text didn't have 3b or 4. Then scholars look at what is called the internal evidence. And this is what I had on a previous slide. The shorter reading is to be preferred. More difficult reading is to be preferred. And one consideration is this. If you make a decision on a certain reading, then how can the others be explained? Now, internally, let's suppose that verses 3b and 4 are omitted. There's a problem that occurs in the text when Jesus, let's suppose you have no description at all about the superstition of the angel that troubles the water. You don't have that, right? When Jesus asks the man, do you want to become well? What does the man say? Anybody remember?
Yeah.
Brian?
Sir, I have no man to, when the water troubles, put me in the water.
And what else?
Everybody beats me.
Yeah, everybody beats me to it. Someone always gets ahead of me. That man's answer to Jesus' question makes absolutely no sense if you don't have that explanation. You with me on that?
Yeah.
Because 3b and 4 relate the superstition about the pool, and that somebody had to get in first. That person who got in first was healed of whatever infirmity they had. So if you don't have that, then the man's answer makes absolutely no sense. Sir, I have no one to put me into the water. Someone always gets in there ahead of me. Now, what may have happened there was a scribe may have put a marginal note in the text to explain the man's crazy answer. And then in the course of time, as this gospel began, the gospel went out to different geographical areas that didn't know what was happening in Jerusalem at that pool. That scribe says, look, let's take it from the margin and stick it into the text so it makes the man's answer make sense. So that's one issue that text critics work with in terms of explaining how some of the other variant readings arose. All right, I ran out of time here. I'm sorry. It's time for over there at the chapel. All righty? Thank you all.